The trans swimmer who dominated women in college swimming this past year is speaking out. Leah Thomas telling ABC News, quote, "People will say, oh, she just transitioned so she would have an advantage, so she could win. I transitioned to be happy, to be true to myself. Trans women competing in women's sports does not threaten women's sports as a whole," end quote. But then there is this, the New York Times showing this article here, and then this snippet, if you will, and it says this, quote, "Peer-reviewed studies show that even after testosterone suppression, top trans women retain a substantial edge when racing against top biological women," end quote. For reaction, we'll bring our panelists back in. Donna, Jackson, Barack, Lori, Wendy, Patrick. Because you were muted, Barack, I'll allow you first word if I can here. So there was Leah Thomas saying there is no threat to women's sports. There's a doctor saying they have a substantial edge in women's sports. Your thoughts?
Right. Well, the doctor who found that there was a substantial edge, he also made that study that water is wet. Of course, the fact is that men, regardless of the hormone suppression, are never going to be down to the less competitive level that the women are. That's just the fact. We all know this. What is fascinating about Leah Thomas's argument there is somehow that he's being true to himself is the fact that he's only thinking about himself. The teammates that he has, and for that matter, the women that he's competing against, he doesn't think one iota about them. And that is the problem of this whole issue, and no one is ever addressing this. It is always the impact that it has on the other women. It's the same thing with the locker room situation, same thing with the bathroom situation. No one ever thinks about how it impacts the women who are in the locker rooms, who are in the bathrooms, or who are competing against men. That's what should be looked at. All it seems to be is how the transgender person, in this case Leah Thompson, seems to think about himself.
I'll go to Donna on that. Your reaction as well. And I know that Barack was pointing out it somewhat for many common sense that this individual would have somewhat of an advantage. Indeed, now a doctor in a peer-reviewed study, which all of us are familiar with studies now because of COVID. This one's peer-reviewed, so we know that's a good one, that there is a substantial edge over women. And that, I just am curious from a female standpoint, for women that are competing, is that difficult to hear?
It really is, because it's only women's sports that are being threatened. You know, there's transgender men too, but nobody's talking about men's sport that will potentially be impacted. It's only the women, and it's very unfair to us. There's always limitations in sports. In Little League, they have age limitations. College sports, they have limitations because of their body sizes. And the fact that this individual who represents less than 1% of the population gets to completely destroy women's sports when you have transgenders and lesbians coming out and saying it's unfair too. It's really disappointing. And the fact that the NCAA would go along with it is difficult to believe.
Wendy, Patrick, your thought, and again, what this does, a broader conversation of what this does to women's sports, women's competition.
Yeah, Sean, I love the way you brought me in on the broader conversation, because that's exactly where I wanted to go with this. I mean, think about it through a historical lens in terms of that broader conversation. I mean, we're looking at potentially undermining over a half-century fight for women equality in sports. I mean, women want to be able to have that competitive advantage, not be at a disadvantage because the rules have been changed. Just when they thought they were finally going to be able to excel and participate in the sport that they've always dreamed of. So you have to look at those kinds of things in context. And both sides are doing this, by the way, when it comes to somebody like Leah, who is biologically superior. And so when you look at the issues of fairness, and should women that have literally put everything on the line to be able to fulfill their dreams of this type of a competition, should they be disadvantaged by these types of rules? I think that's a conversation that everyone is interested in weighing in on, regardless of what side you're on, only because it impacts everyone, especially when we're talking about equality in women's sports.
I appreciate the woman's perspective on this, as it is very important in this conversation. Donna, Jackson, Wendy, Patrick, Barack, Lori, thank you all three. We do appreciate your time.